Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I want to welcome back Karl Rove, but particularly welcome for the first time here, Governor Walker.
Thanks.
And again, for the first time up here, our new writer, Tiana Lowe. Everybody, please make her feel here at home. So, conservatism has I grew up with Ronald Reagan as a president, and it meant something very particular. And I came to Washington, and there were some debates under the presidency of George W. Bush about what wasn't conservatism, but we kind of had interesting starting lines. We had the same premises. And then we got the Tea Party, which sounds familiar, sounds like a return to roots. And then all of a sudden, in 2016, we elected a guy who was a populist before he was a conservative, I think. So I'm going to start by asking you, Karl, has Donald Trump either redefined conservatism, reshaped the conservative movement, or changed the degree to which the Republican Party is a conservative party?
Yes, no, and I don't know. Look, he's not an ideologue. In fact, that was one of his attractions, was that he was the guy who was going to be able to cut deals. And so I don't think he knows. He thinks Hayek was the guy who developed Long Island. And von Mises is some German who was trying to sell some kind of energy device to developers. I mean, he's not a guy who grew up reading conservatives, thinking conservatives. And as a result, his impact on the conservative movement is more to do with how his style is. We have this debate now going on. I think it's largely a dead-end debate between some elements of the conservative movement who say the main problem is we haven't done everything we can to devalue and discredit our opponents as being unworthy of respect. We haven't fought hard enough against them. And anybody who's a conservative who's not fought hard enough against them is not a true conservative. And we've got to be uncivil, we've got to be angry, we've got to be bitter, we've got to be nasty, we've got to be mean, just like they have been to us. I think that's been aided by the president because he loves to punch back, but it's given an element inside our movement an excuse to say this is how we ought to conduct ourselves, and this is the main thing we need to worry about for the future of conservatism. I think the main problem for conservatism is that we've been successful. We beat the commies. We established the idea when you had Bill Clinton, and to a lesser extent, though he didn't mean it, Barack Obama, recognize the limits of government. When we have the consensus that we have in terms of support for free enterprise in the country, then people have said, okay, well, what's next? And we have not, both conservatism and liberalism in America have not kept up with the new challenges the country faces, in my opinion. And so conservatism is going through a crisis because we had this alliance of economic conservatives, national security conservatives, and cultural conservatives who were all in opposition to the great Soviet Union, and we won. And it began to weaken the fibers that drew all three of those elements together, the libertarians, the cultural conservatives, and the national security conservatives. So we've got to go through a debate inside our movement as to how we take these timeless principles of conservatism and apply them to the new circumstances in which the country and the world finds itself.
Governor Walker, your reaction, do you agree? We won, the conservatives won?
Well, if you look, clearly the president's a populist, no doubt about that. But really, if you look at other than some really big issues like trade and maybe prescription drugs, depending on what happens, this president far exceeded my expectations as a conservative than I ever dreamed of. Now, I also said he's exceeded my view of his temperament, probably in the opposite direction from where I would have been at. But I often say in Wisconsin, which is probably the epicenter of presidential politics these days as it has been in the past, that Washington, D.C. is filled with politicians who say and do all the right things, in terms of comments and tweets, don't get squat done. This president may not talk or tweet the way I would, but on substance, I mean, look at the judiciary, not just the 2 Supreme Court justices we talk about, 160 conservative judges that meet the test, the Federalist Society, purists were on the court. Not only that, I mean, think about Reagan and tax cuts. This president is right on track with that in terms of tax cuts. Regulatory reform, repealed 22 reforms for everyone added. You go down the line, even as much as I love Reagan, and I came of age, I was 12 years old when Ronald Reagan was first elected in 1980, and I'm not just a conservative Republican because of him, I'm an optimist because of him. And that is one of the things that's missing, the aspirational view out there. We can come back and talk about that. But I think substantively, pro-life movement, you go down the list, this president has delivered on the conservative agenda time and time and time and time again.
So, Tiana, do you think conservatism under Trump means the same thing it used to, or what's your view on this?
It's certainly changed, I think, for better and for worse. On the one hand, I think that the sense that the so-called forgotten man has a voice is a good thing, and it's an important thing, and it's necessary for the electoral viability of the Republican Party, obviously. And especially if you look at the number of Obama to Trump voters that delivered him the Oval Office. But on the other hand, we have lost the principles to an extent. One of the things that's a common refutation online whenever people challenge, like for instance, Senator Josh Hawley's pushes to give the federal government more control over Facebook and other social media outlets. If a conservative points out that, do you want that power in the hands of a supposed President Elizabeth Warren, or worse, a supposed President Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I don't think that's necessarily what we would want. And the fact is that the fiscal principles of conservatism are vital to maintaining every other aspect that we want. You know, the more that we allow, for instance, the federalization of the healthcare industry, which, mind you, is 1/5 of the American economy, then yes, Catholic doctors will be forced one day to perform abortions, and people will be forced to live and act against their will and against their principles. If you bring this up, the common refutation is, what is conservatism conserving? And that's a great question, because in spite of the fact of all of these victories, we still are seeing losses in terms of my generation understanding the virtues of religion, of two-parent households, of economic liberty, of free trade. We are losing all of that. What the president does do excellently is he taps into all the right problems. I don't believe that a trade war without going through the proper WTO channels is the correct way to combat China, but absolutely, he has completely shifted the Overton window on what is appropriate for talking about the worst human rights violators on planet Earth today. Credit to Trump for diagnosing that. But just the solutions aren't grounded in principle, and that's the fear in terms of how we preserve this movement.
Yeah, so now there's two ways I want to go on this. One is, and we'll get back to this in a sec, yes, Trump doesn't read Friedrich Hayek and Edmund Burke, but I also want to know whether he also helped kill them a little bit more. But before we get to that, I want to, well, no, let's get to that right now. Is it true, we look at, again, Josh Hawley pushing for federal regulation of social media in the name of a sort of conservatism. And you just see a lot of people turning to Washington for their solutions. Why did they elect sort of the strong man up on the stage? It's because I alone can fix it, as he said. So is the conservative movement becoming more nationalist and more centralized in their mindset than a Burkean, Kirkian conservatism would be?
Well, I'll throw this out just because, as mentioned, I'm president-elect, something I tried to be a couple years ago. So I'm milking this for all I can.
Mr. P.E.?
Yeah, Mr. P.E. Mr. P.E. I'll go out and lead recess in a little bit here, but Mr. President-elect of Young America's Foundation. So I spent a lot of time on college campuses already preparing for this and with high schoolers and others. And the good and the bad of it, you mentioned demographics, which Karl knows extremely well, but if you read the polls, you should be frightened to go on campus because the polls show, Gallup's one poll shows that nearly 60% of adults under the age of 30 believe that socialism is somehow acceptable. Worse than that, sadly, is a poll that shows, by Gallup as well, that shows the same age group, less than 25% are exceptionally proud to be Americans. So total failure of K through 12, problems in our colleges and universities, public and private, problems with the influence of people like Barack Obama in that age group, and now increasingly AOC and others, as we mentioned, just problems overall. But I'm an optimist. And so I'll give you the other side of that, and that is when I go to college campuses, I would contend, while there are some socialists there, no doubt, I would contend that more young people are libertarians than they are liberals. And a classic example of this, and goes to the heart of your question, where we've got to go beyond, we can't just rely on the president, as historically parties have on either side of the spectrum. We've got to make this case ourselves and go beyond just digital and other forms to make this case. And the simple thing is, when I go to campuses, I ask them this question: how many of you have been in a taxi? Hardly any hands go up. I say, how many of you have ever been in an Uber? Campuses, every single hand goes up, right? I said, that's the difference between freedom. I went out, NSA taking me out here, but that's the difference between the taxis are socialism, the Uber's freedom. And it's not just free enterprise, it's freedom, because socialism's not just economics, it's a whole change of lifestyle. The contrast says freedom. I say socialism is like a taxi, because taxis are highly regulated, highly restricted. There's a big fear of tax involved with it. They keep other people out from entering the profession. That's what socialism does. It tells you what to do and when to do and how to do it, because people who believe in socialism believe in the government. On contrast, I point out that freedom is like Uber or Lyft or any of those services like that. All they care about is that you safely get from point A to point B. All we care about, those of us who believe in freedom, who are right of center, all we care about is, in the end, as long as you don't hurt the health and safety of your neighbor, go out and do your own thing. Live your own life. Pursue your own dream. We believe in the individual. They believe in the government. Interestingly enough, it's fun watching crowds like I'm looking here today, but if I was on a college campus, I could tell the college Republicans, because they're all dressed like I am right now. I can tell there is no college Democrats. They're the Progressive Student Organization or whatever. They look like they got confused and were looking for the free pot seminar. And then in the middle, literally and figuratively, are a bunch of students who just kind of were curious. And when I tell them that, it's like somebody hit them with something they hadn't heard before. Because to your point, all they hear about on campus and culture often is that conservatives are the ones telling you what not to do. We got to get rid of that image, because we're not. Think about it. Think about every one of you here. Why did you become a conservative? Why did you become a libertarian or conservative? You came because you didn't want other people telling you what to do. You wanted to work hard and live the American dream. You wanted the same for your family and for others. And we tell that story, we win, but we can't rely on somebody in Washington to do that for us. We got to do it over and over again ourselves.
Thank you. I'm just going to turn Tiana, though, now, because you brought up what the young people think, and Tiana is our young person here.
Only
last
she's
year,
entitled to say what they think, Walker.
Last year, I think I counted as a young person because I was 39, but now I'm not anymore. So you're the young person. Tell us what you know about the youth attitude towards conservatism and their understanding of it.
So my coming of age to conservatism involved two things. One, that I had 4 grandparents who all fled communist dictatorships, and turned out it was pretty terrible. And second was South Park. And I wish I were kidding, but that was kind of, prior to me ever reading Milton Friedman, prior to me ever reading Thomas Paine, my first understanding of the virtues of liberty in a social sphere, and as how we inculcate norms, came from South Park. And I was reflecting on this my last year at USC. I was the editor of the Economics Review, and a freshman had come to me and complained that his RA asked that he take down a South Park poster that was inside of his dorm room. And I was thinking, it starts from here. It starts from the fact that we have completely disrupted the concept of American adulthood to the point where we're telling people the key to success is leave your parents' home, go into a dorm for 4 years, have everything taken care of, have your professors only give you knowledge that does not trigger you, avoid the harsh realities of life. I've worked minimum wage jobs. I think that most of my friends have.
She is not currently working a minimum wage job, to be clear.
No, and
Maybe not according to your definition, my friend.
We won't stop until minimum wage is $20 an hour. That one's important. But I do think that a lot of those experiences that are meant to break you down a little and then build you up as a person, we are missing. And so it winds up that in the pursuit of some sort of existential threat, because we don't have the Soviet Union anymore, and unfortunately we're more interested right now in virtue signaling than we are in looking at the reality of a place like China that there are millions of Muslims and ethnic minorities in China in concentration camps. Yeah, everyone's fine watching NBA games. And so in the pursuit of that, they found something like climate change, which is this sort of ephemeral, omnipotent issue that conveniently has no actual solution. I mean, bring up nuclear power on a college campus in response to climate change, and the first answer will be, what about capitalism? Yeah. And we failed to explain the realities of economics on a basic level, not just on college campuses, but to my entire generation. My generation is more supportive of Social Security than any other generation, and yet we will be the ones most harmed by it. We are the ones who are going to face multi-trillion-dollar deficits as a result of entitlements just exploding over the next 20 years. And yet we fail to care about it because all we care about are these problems that have no obvious or, controversial solutions.
Yeah. Karl?
Yeah, I want to return to something Scott said earlier. I agree with you about the president following a conservative agenda in most things. But in each and every one of them, he's had a willing partner who's been the driver. When it came to tax reform, you had Kevin Brady at House Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee, and to a lesser extent, Mnuchin. When you came to the regulatory framework, Bernie Marcus underwrites an effort during the campaign, goes on the plane in July, gives the big, thick notebook of regulatory changes to candidate Trump, who grabs onto it. A Federalist Society, somebody says to him, several people say to him, conservative judges really matter. And look, Trump is about keeping a promise. He made these promises. He's got a mental list of these things. He thinks all of them help get him there, so by God, he's going to get them done. The problem is these are all areas where he has been a willing partner with others. The question is occasionally, like we get to the question of sort of his response to Charlottesville, he picked the wrong willing partner, Steve Bannon. Oh, just say that there are good people on both sides of this, which was seen as praise for the neo-Nazis. And then trade, where he thinks he knows something about it. Sometimes I think he's right on target when he stands up and talks about they're stealing our intellectual property. Sometimes I think he's right on target when he says, we abide by the rules, why aren't they? But then I see sometimes the protectionist that pops up who says, you know what, you need to buy more from us. And sometimes I see the mercantilist when Peter Navarro basically convinces him that the only good trade deal is if you buy more from us than we buy from you, which means we're screwing the English, the Brits, every day because they buy more from us than we buy from them. But, those areas where that's why conservatism is not going to be, the problems of modern conservatism are not going to be resolved, in my opinion, under his leadership, because he's working with conservatives when it is fulfillment of something that was fundamental to his campaign, and where he doesn't have conservative grounding, sometimes he's in the right place, sometimes he's not. And Reagan was a thinker. This book was mentioned earlier this morning about his radio scripts. If you've not read this book, it's by a protege of Martin Anderson, Reagan's domestic policy guy. He went in and found, everybody assumed that those radio scripts were written by somebody for Reagan, and he went into the archives and found the yellow pads in Reagan's handwriting with Reagan writing them and re-editing, going back over and making edits. Reagan wrote every one of those radio scripts. And you suddenly realize that was a fantastic mind that looked at things in a really remarkable way. I did a piece recently for the Reagan Foundation on the Time for Decision speech with Barry Goldwater, which is a fantastic speech. You can watch it on YouTube. One thing I realized when I'm watching the film of it, he spoke off of this. This is an unbelievably articulate, easy-flowing, well-presented speech, and he is doing it off of 4x6 cards. Because he had thought this thing through and internalized it so much, he was able to share that message. We're not going to get another Reagan, but we need more people who have thought deeply about these issues and are helping us decide what needs to be done to confront them in the 21st century.
So in a little bit, I want to get into more pragmatic nuts and bolts things, but one or two more high-level questions. I remember it used to be that Republicans and conservatives would campaign on fiscal conservatism and then govern completely different. And now it seems that they don't even bother to campaign on fiscal conservatism. And the lesson that some Democrats are taking from Elizabeth Warren's recent troubles is her problem was that when she promised Medicare for all, she said, we're going to figure out a way to pay for it. When the smart thing would have been to promise Medicare for all and then don't even think about paying for it. And there's some evidence that on the score of politics, that's right. The most popular politicians in America are Republican governors who just spend like crazy and don't hike your taxes. That includes mine in Maryland, as well as we had Illinois, and then there's Massachusetts. Is fiscal conservative budget discipline still part of conservatism? And I know you think it is for you. You're out there trying to get a balanced budget amendment. Are you fighting against the tide?
Well, it's certainly not in Washington. I would argue it's in the states. And actually, to go back to some of your original questions, I would argue part of the reason why President Donald Trump is president is because of governors and state lawmakers in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and Florida that did act responsibly, not only on economic, but on fiscal policy. I mean, in our case, for example, we inherited about a $3.6 billion structural deficit when we came in. All 8 years I was governor, we had a surplus. Our rainy day fund was 190 times bigger when we took office. Our pension was fully funded by the time we left. And we cut taxes by over $13 billion. So showing you can do all those things. I think at the state level, Republicans, not in every area, as you allude to, but at least in areas where there's a Republican governor and Republican legislative majorities, particularly in states that aren't necessarily red, but are more purple to blue, because a lot of us came in and said, we've got a short fuse here. We got to get as much done as we can. But I think if you're clear about it and decisive about it, act early about it. The toughest thing people can do is try and do it late in a term, because the closer you get to an election, the more the excuses we're too close to an election. It's the best piece of advice I got from Mitch Daniels was do it quickly, be aggressive about it. But you're right, it's part of the reason why I'm pushing a balanced budget, because without a balanced budget amendment, I mean, I mentioned the states, but part of the reason why the states are in such good position is 49 of the 50 states have a balanced budget amendment requirement in their state constitutions. You got to have it in the federal government. You talked about trillions before. When I was a kid, Ronald Reagan pushed the balanced budget amendment. In '81, the federal debt hit $1 trillion for the first time. In 5 years, interest payments on the federal debt will exceed $1 trillion. Put it in more bluntly, that's like having a kid make $46,000 a year with $300,000 in debt, paying $10,000 a year alone in interest on that debt, and oh yeah, your kid is spending more than $46,000 a year, so only adding to the debt each year. If we had a kid or a grandkid doing that, we'd have an intervention. We'd flat out have an intervention, and yet we don't in the federal government. There's no way we can rely on it. It's too easy to just print money and keep borrowing, but at some point, in less than a decade, your interest is too great. You can't even print money and borrow enough to cover what's out there, and we've got to have an intervention with the federal government. The only way to do that is at the state level.
And I got to think that, I mean, I know liberals think that's bad for liberalism because it might curtail their spending, but I think it's bad for conservatism because it'll make taxes go up, it'll make government become a bigger part of our lives, and it'll be a vicious circle. I mean, where do you guys see, is there any reason why after decades of being promised that Republicans were going to be fiscally conservative, they will be in the future, or what, or are they giving up on it?
There's a very easy reason. On January 20th, 2009, the public debt of the United States, that form of the debt that's securitized in a bond with all of our names on it, was equal to 40% of GDP, and as of this morning, it's 78. And it's going up. And we're going to be in nosebleed territory. And there is not going to be some gigantic, European Union, International Monetary Fund, China bailout. We're going to be stuck unless we do something. Now,
I just feel like crisis situations for countries don't generally lead to sane free market reforms. They lead to strongmen. They lead to socialism. They lead to populist uprisings.
Maybe, but states have handled this. They didn't require an authoritarian strongman to solve a $3.6 billion structural shortfall when Walker took the governorship, takes leadership. But we do need to have leadership on it because it is a growing problem. From the end of World War II, when we were at about 118% of GDP, the public debt, we worked our way down to about 40. actually to about 38, and then along came the financial crisis of 2008. I'm actually sort of a weird one on this. I'm with Hamilton. He was mentioned earlier. I'm not adverse to having a debt, as long as the debt is growing smaller than the percentage that we're growing our economy. Because, I mean, think about our own personal lives. How many of us have a debt? It's called a mortgage. And we're not afraid of having that mortgage bigger than our annual salary, as long as we're continuing to both grow our salary and continue to be employed. So, but we are in nosebleed territory, and nobody in Washington seems to be concerned about it right now. Part of that is that you got a Democrat House and a Republican Senate, and budgeteers understand you're not going to be able to get much done there except, be Horatio at the bridge, suffer a few more cuts, hope to survive until another day, and bleed and not bleed to death.
Tiana, on the budget?
It's funny that the same people who are calling for the expansion of Social Security are the ones who are encouraging the kind of lifestyles that lead to below replacement rate fertility.
Everybody should have more kids.
That is the Tim Carney.
Carney, are you a Catholic? I'm just inquiring.
I am. And actually, last night at the trivia, I was telling a lot of jokes, and I also mentioned that I had 6 kids, and some people thought that that was a joke. It's not a joke. My wife is home with 6 kids. Her name is Katie. If you pray for her. Thank you. Sorry, Tiana, back to you.
I love your wife. She's very fun.
We will be collecting money afterwards for psychological counseling for Katie.
So it's one of the biggest issues here is that it's a messaging issue. When I try and explain to people what happens when we inevitably have a credit crunch because creditors finally lose faith in the American government's abilities to pay back their debts, the number one thing everyone jumps to is defense spending. Right now, defense spending is 30% of entitlements, and in 10 years from now, it'll be far less than that. It comes down to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, 3 programs that everyone wants to expand. Now, it's not a fashionable thing to talk about, but this does go if you are going to be as apocalyptic as possible about climate change, something that I think is caused by human activity. At least that has a semi-obvious solution in the form of technological advancements, renewables in the long run, but no one wants to look at the elephant in the room, which is our $22 trillion national debt. And one of the issues, my biggest fear with Trump's candidacy, aside from his gregariousness and comments that he had made about minorities and women, which again those are not things that my generation loves. The biggest one was that he said that he wouldn't touch entitlements, because if the Republican in the White House with a Republican-controlled Senate and House and an open Supreme Court seat can't curb entitlements, who can? Because it's not going to be Elizabeth Warren. It's not going to be Bernie Sanders. And that's the issue. It's a messaging war. We need to get public opinion in my generation on our side.
Yeah, I think there's a million ways we can go on this, but I want to get, again, to a little bit of nuts and bolts. So, Governor Walker, how should people out there understand the infrastructure on college campuses of conservatism, as far as you've been introduced to it as president-elect, et cetera? What is the infrastructure that's out there? Is every campus totally overrun with leftists and the conservatives are all hiding in the basements, or is there a real infrastructure of conservatism on campus?
Well, yes to the first part. Are they overrun? Yeah, public and private. Sadly, even a lot of private institutions are overrun. You look at these lists that come out every year of all the things you're supposed to not say and say on campuses. One of the most outrageous was, I was in Colorado back in, and yes, actually, I know where Colorado is. It's north of New Mexico, not on the.
There's no wall on Colorado.
There's no wall on Colorado. I was born in Colorado Springs, actually, but the. In Colorado State actually had a list of those words, as crazy as they are. You can't. You're not supposed to say he or she, him or her. Those are all over the place. But at Colorado State, what really took the case this year was they added to that list America and American. Think about that. And the reason, they actually give reasons for this. The reason was because people might imply to fellow students and faculty and others that American means you're better than others.
So what do we have to combat that? I'm trying to give them some hope out there.
Well, the good news is, and as much as they're under fire on this, I go back to what I said before about I still think, even without the guidance So many of their professors, students are more libertarian than liberal. But you've got groups like YAF that I'll be a part of. Young Americans for Freedom's got about 500 chapters. You've got Turning Point, which YAF is more of the philosophical long-term. Turning Point is more the political action, get involved, identify people for the upcoming election. You've got groups obviously like College Republicans that are the folks that are on the ground, putting up yard signs, helping out along the way. And I can just tell you even anecdotally, I've got two kids, one who went to a private Catholic Jesuit institution, the other went to the University of Wisconsin. Which if you don't know about University of Wisconsin, I'm cheering for them on Saturday for the ball game against Ohio State. Thank you. But they're a little bit like Berkeley in the Midwest in terms of how liberal that campus is. My son Alex actually came out more conservative than he went in because he was surrounded, found a group of like-minded people. They've got one of the biggest CR chapters in the country there. And so I think the key to encourage people who are helping with campuses, who are helping young people, whether your kids, your grandkids, your nieces, your nephews, and others, is encourage them to get involved and then go help those groups and mentor those groups and tell your stories and tell how you live the American dream, because you can't yell at them. You've got to be a part of it. You've got to lift them up and you've got to tell them those stories and encourage them along the way. Because I think there's a lot of students who aren't sitting at those meetings but who should be, who aren't wearing outfits like this, but are sitting in jeans and T-shirts. But really, when they get to the heart of it, someday they want to start their own business. Someday they want to pursue their own career. They just need to be told that the far left, the socialists that are trying to control this country, are not going to help them, and those of us who believe in freedom are.
Tiana, you recently were a conservative on a campus that was not quite so conservative. Tell us about that.
So I was fascinated to discover that the battleground of campus conservatism at a school like USC was not actually the political entities, although I was a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, did an attempt to dox me. The real battleground were the fraternities. And it was interesting because many members of, so 1 out of every 4 USC students are a member of Greek life. I wasn't because I didn't want to, it just seemed like a waste of time. But those wound up becoming my greatest allies when I would write about politics, and especially politics on campus, because universities want to shut them down. Because any semblance of free association that isn't sanctioned by the school is seen as heretical. So I had so many friends who started in Greek life, and they were very apolitical, probably socially liberal, not in an activist way, but just did not really have skin in the game politically. And I think that their first brush with understanding the way that the roots of leftism translate into not just campus politics, but just the culture that's being inculcated, their first brush with that was USC trying to eventually shut down all of the fraternities and the sororities, because in their mind, they want to have more control over the social life of the school. I mean, my joke was that, if we can radicalize people into becoming conservatives by warning them that they're going to take away their beer pong and their frat party, then I'm all for it. That's a pretty good selling point. But the issue then becomes that getting a liberal arts degree at many of these universities, it is indoctrination. So it's funny when you go to the engineering departments, the math department, which I was in, the economics department, everyone's very average. You have your liberals, you have your conservatives, you have your leftists, you have your libertarians. It's when you go into
the people who don't have to deal with facts.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, those are the kids who are the most privileged. They're the ones who they're not taking out any debt on their tuition. They have all the time in the world to protest because they don't actually do any work. So the encouragement, honestly, it is kind of an economic argument when we inevitably send our kids to school. What is the return on investment? If you get your lesbian dance theory degree, what are you going to do with it? If your plan is to get a PhD and this is how much debt you're going to take out and this is your estimated earnings, then sure, do it. But will 90% of those humanities majors, will that happen? No, but we've ceased to talk about college as an economic conversation, which is what we should be doing.
And so, I mean, what you're describing there about the fraternities, this is something Alexis de Tocqueville warned about specifically. The central state it wants its people to be happy, but it doesn't want its people to be gathering together into its own little platoons for happiness, because it wants to be the sole source of their happiness. And this is what the university sees too. So just my 10-second opinion here is that the future of conservatism is in the continued strength of the little platoons, the parishes, community groups, and that sort of thing, and the devolving of power, and that as long as those can hold out, there's a good future for conservatism. But that's part of the reason that, Obama needs to go after orders of nuns, for instance, and to break up their power.
And it's why if you go to Prague, for example, just as one of many examples, because of the communist rule there for so long, you go even after the Velvet Revolution, most of the churches and synagogues don't have people attending them today because they pushed them out from going there for exactly that reason. It's the same communist philosophy that's appearing on a lot of our college campus.
And you add on top of that the fact that fraternities and sororities use the words him and her, and you've got a real problem.
That's really problematic.
There can be no safe spaces for
Well,
women.
so turning to these social issues and back to the question of whether we're winning. We currently have a debate in this country over whether men can be pregnant. And we're not supposed to have a debate. If you look at one of the scandals involving a current Democratic member of Congress, we're not supposed to debate whether it's, well, if she's in a throuple, that's none of our business, and it's nobody's business, and it's perfectly fine. Throuple is a couple with 3 people, and I look around at what our culture is being taught. The idea that if you dare to say, actually, in my belief, marriage is between man and a woman, which is what my church, the Catholic Church, teaches. It's what I believe. Saying that in public is considered hate speech by multiple U.S. senators. The pro-life laws passed down here in the South. You had countries, the parent companies of ABC and NBC both said, well, that's beyond the pale. We won't do business in this state anymore. So there's very powerful people saying that conservative views that have been held for millennia, talking about social issues now, are out of bounds. Aren't we losing really badly on these issues? I'm going to start with you, Karl, because you're the one who said conservatives were winning.
No, look, we have the youngest generations are the most pro-life in our country. And it's ironic because they are simultaneously in favor of a woman's right to choose and are most personally opposed to abortion in their own lives. You cannot look at a sonogram and not say that's a human being, a life. So, yeah, we on the issue of traditional marriage, did the Supreme Court uphold gay marriage? Yes, it's the law of the land now. But does that mean that the vast majority of American people aren't willing to let people believe what they want to believe, particularly if it's dictated by faith? Yeah, they are. And if this thing of Robert Francis O'Rourke going out the other day and saying, if I'm going to take away the tax advantage of a church, I mean, one of the things that got so much coverage was it was so extreme.
But the sort of moderate position in the Democratic Party is, no, behind church doors, you're allowed to do whatever you want.
Yeah,
but the minute you step out into the public square, well, then you're bound to play by our rules.
That's not the, quote, Democratic Party. Those are Democratic Party activists who represent an extreme view. And as long as conservatives have a reasonable tone and an inclusive nature, we'll win this argument. I mean, why do you think that parts of the country have moved away from being Democrat to being Republican? Is because the Democratic Party moved away from them. And this is that sort of subsided for a while. Now we're about ready to see it on the social front go even weirder, because this whole thing about like saying you can't use him and her, and you can't believe that, otherwise you're a bigot. I mean, that is the kind of thing that grates on the good common sense of most ordinary Americans. So I say, let the fight come on, as long as we respond in the right way, which is to be in sorrow and disappointment that you would treat a fellow American in that way, and that you would not. I mean, it's this idea of hating America, for example. I mean, these people who say America's bad. Fine, let's take them on each and every time, because we're going to win people to our cause by saying we're standing up for this great country. And same in these other instances. We have a big battle going on now in Texas. Unfortunate situation. Man and a wife husband and wife getting divorced. They have a 7-year-old child. She wants the child to go through surgery to become a girl. And the courts, which had granted her custody, have now come back and said it's going to be joint custody, because it was such an extreme measure that even the judge who had awarded her custody said, I'm not going to let that decision be made by the mother for the 7-year-old, because once you start that surgery, you can't go back. And, we have some activists in our state that are taking her side, but I'm going to tell you, that's a complete loser culturally if people want to make that argument.
Tiana.
So I guess the difference between leftism and progressivism, and part of the reason why I agree with Karl, is that under progressivism, you will be made to care. So I spent pretty much my entire childhood and young adult life mostly knowing people who were socially liberal. People who were always pro-gay marriage, anti-Prop 8 in California. And for the first time in my life, I'm hearing from people saying that the left has just moved too far because when people hear the Beto proposal, yes, it is something that I think clandestinely the Elizabeth Warrens of the world secretly endorse as well, but the rest of the country do not. And this is why the fact that Joe Biden has been able to maintain this lead for so long gives me a little bit of hope. I was about as anti-Obama as a biracial teenager from LA could have been, but I still respect the fact that Joe Biden, in spite of all the crazy capital gains tax increases, he's still fundamentally a liberal. I do not think that Joe Biden wants to have mandatory gun confiscation. And, so the element of progressivism, making people care, if you look at the polling, for instance, on an issue like abortion, some 6 out of 10 Americans identify as pro-choice, but the polling is almost identical for the amount of people who say that abortion is immoral when it's purely elective, when it's not because of rape, incest, finances, when it's just because a woman doesn't feel like having a child. And as Karl pointed out, this number is growing among my generation. And in part, it's because the left jumped the shark and they made everyone care. If I am someone who favors deregulating contraception so women can obtain it over the counter or via a pharmacist's prescription, the moment you start saying, oh, but we're going to shut down the Little Sisters of the Poor if they don't want to cover it, that makes me want to. That's something that I think galvanizes people who don't even agree with them, because we understand that this country was built on the notion of free association. So on the social issues, I am slightly more hopeful, and it's only because I think we've kind of hit the nadir of where things are going in terms of fertility rates, in terms of marriage. I don't think people are happy with the status quo.
You mentioned Elizabeth Warren. You may have seen I had to watch this. I had to watch all the CNN LGBTQT.
There was 18 hours of that.
Look, it was 8 hours of it.
Do you feel woke now?
Yeah, I feel ill. But there was this moment, the best moment was Elizabeth Warren. She was asked a question by the reporter who said, well, what if somebody said to you, my faith causes me to believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. What would you say to them? Now, there are lots of ways that somebody who believes in gay marriage can respond to that. And she says, well, I guess that's probably a man asking the question like that. And
presuming gender is not allowed, I thought.
Yeah. So I'd say to him, if you want to be married to one woman, I guess I'm cool with that. If you could find one. Now, I had a friend who was taken aback by this. So he was running a focus group. So at the end of the focus group, which was sort of mostly swing voters, all he did was show that without any comment and had the little dials so that people could react to it. You should have seen those dials go way down. And this was a group of people who were sort of economically moderate, conservative, but socially liberal, swing voters, college-educated suburbanites, and they didn't like that tone. And that's why we're not going to win it automatically, but we are going to be helped in winning it by our opponents being over the top and sanctimonious like she was in that comment.
Well, and it goes to the heart of what you're both saying, which is, one, you're saying tone for us is important, how we respond to that. I think you're exactly right about jumping the shark. Part of the reason my blood pressure is so low, my life is so good, is I don't read the responses on Twitter when I post something, and I don't watch Democratic presidential campaign debates or any of those other sessions out there. I wait to see what the Examiner and others talk about. But two quick things on this. So one, talking about jumping the shark and extremism, Ralph Northam probably did more for the pro-life movement than any other politician in the pro-life movement. Ralph, of course, being the governor of Virginia, a pediatrician no less, who on January 30th said, a child's delivered, a child is set aside, a child is kept comfortable, and then the doctor and the family decide what to do with that child. Now, if you wait a couple hours later and you go home, in most states, I think every state, you decide what to do with that child. That's called homicide. The irony was when they started talking about it there, and then it got similar debates occurred in New York and Vermont, or excuse me, in Rhode Island and other places out there. One of the polls taken a couple weeks after that showed, and it's pretty consistent since, the two biggest groups of people who shifted towards the pro-life movement were millennials and people who identified as Democrat voters. Now, it doesn't mean they're both pro-life, but there was the biggest shift. I think it goes to your point about jumping the shark out there. They go too far, but then to Karl's point as well, we've got to respond not by matching the extremism of the rhetoric, but by being loving and caring but firm in our positions and respectful, and point out how disrespectful they are to people who don't share this belief. I think the other one that's just, it's been woefully undercovered, but I'm still amazed when I see these recent stories about transgender women who are winning sporting events. And I got to think, again, you go back, I mean, talk about conflicted triggering, about at what point do female athletes say, this is baloney? And anybody who believes in basic fairness say, this is absolutely outrageous. These are the sorts of things where they're literally jumping the shark. And I think as long as we don't engage with just equally as far out there rhetoric, we can win the cultural war on that.
So a couple of these questions have touched on race in a couple of ways. One is, I mean, I remember in the Bush years, some of you guys, I was working for Bob Novak at the time, and he wanted to believe what some of the Bush White House was saying was that you can turn the Hispanic vote into being a conservative vote. But then I looked at the numbers. You guys didn't spend any money in any district. There was 2 districts out of the 40 that were majority Hispanic, and only 2 of them did even try to run a candidate. So there was not actual effort to reach out to the Hispanic vote. Is there any reason to think it's going to do better in the future?
Boy, I hope you've improved your investigative skills since then. We got 44% of the Latino vote in the 2004 re-election.
For Bush, but in the congressional elections, in most districts that were, even if there were 33% Hispanic in a congressional district, the Republican Party spent no money on the congressional candidate.
Well,
and so I'm thinking if you're reaching out to
it depends on whether or not you got a viable candidate. Take Will Hurd, for example, in Texas. You know, his district, he's African-American Republican CIA agent, and his district is 2/3 Hispanic. And yeah, I mean, it was one of the few places since leaving the presidency that Bush has done a fundraiser for a congressional candidate. So yeah, I mean.
So you see there's, I mean, what do you tell Hispanic electorates? What's the hope that it's going to move to the Republic? Because here's talk about the rhetoric on immigration. I think that you can be fairly restrictive on immigration, but when your first comment on it is they're not sending us their best, they're sending us their rapists, etc.
That's a very important point, critical point, because look, my border state of Texas, you want to see some hard asses on immigration, you go to the Rio Grande Valley and talk to the local mayor or the local county commissioner or the local community leader, because it's their communities that are being affected by people coming running across the border and you know, impacting their hospitals, impacting the safety of their communities and so forth. But you have to operate from a position of respect. And the one great thing, look, Texas, think about this. Texas has a higher percentage of its population that is Latino than the rest of the country, by a big margin, higher percentage of the population that's African American, higher percentage of population that's Asian American than the rest of the country, and yet we're red. And the reason is because Republican candidates in Texas have been in the habit for 50 or 60 years of treating all Texans as Texans. So when you kick off your campaign, you're doing a Tiana in San Antonio. You go to Tiana restaurant, owned by a bunch of Republican Hispanics who love to host the kickoff of everybody who's running for governor or statewide office. When you go to the Rio Grande Valley, you're down there not just at election time, but in between election times, working the community. And that's why, you know, we routinely get 40 to 45% of the vote in Texas for Republican candidates up and down the ballot.
But the rest of the country isn't starting
to look more
like
Texas. You know what? The rest of the country ought to
Texas.
come to Texas and pay attention.
Tiana, you're from the rest of the country. You're from California. In California, I mean, the immigration issue and the Hispanic immigration has killed the Republican majority there.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that if you compare the California test case to Texas, you have exactly the blueprint in California for how to tank a Republican Party. I mean, the California Republican attitude. So I'm from Orange County. I am from the county that used to have the Orange Wall, the most Republican, major, wealthy county in the state, collapsed in 2018. There was not a Republican representing a district in Orange County anymore. We lost all of them. And in large part, it's because the Republican Party in California gave up. They said it's totally fine and good that 40% of all Californians in Los Angeles County are on Medicare or Medicaid or Medi-Cal. That's fine. We can have this homelessness crisis. We can allow all these NIMBYist laws create housing crunch. It's all good. And the Republican Party's response in California, I mean, if you're looking at the most controversial members of House Republicans, Dana Rohrabacher for one, and a number of others I'm not going to name check up here, the ones who were the most controversial and the most, I think damaging to the national brand, they're almost all from California because it's sort of been neighbor against neighbor has been pivoted by both parties. And the Democratic Party is obviously equally to blame in the sense of otherizing all the demographics. The lack of integration in California is a massive problem. And that's why conservatives need to be the ones to say, your sense of an American identity is propelled by your principles. Do you believe in the separation of church and state? Do you believe in liberty, justice, and equality under the law for all? And that's why my fear with Trump's rhetoric is that it's very European in the sense that he will flirt with the idea of, in France, the saying, in the Front National, far-right party, they'll always say, France is for the French, the idea being that the state should provide welfare, but only for people who are ethnically French, only for people with ethnic ties. And I don't think that Trump does this because of any racial animus in his heart, but I think that the strongman in him sort of hears America for Americans. And the danger with that is that when we discuss immigration, there's a massive difference between discussing Mexicans of Catholic identity who come to America and work hard and integrate versus people coming from countries with no conception of democracy or Christianity or Judeo-Christian values at all. And so I think what Texas has done well is treat Texans like Texans first, and then all of your identity matters later, whereas the California Republican Party has sort of resigned itself to it is the farmers versus the immigrants versus the natives.
And I think that's a setup that's very, we can't win the more that things get divided.
Right.
We in a second, I'm going to let Scott comment on the immigration and the race issues, but just so that you guys can start thinking of your last question, I'm going to ask you for a very brief description of what you see about the future of conservatism. So sort of, you're going to spin a future tale in imagination, so get your imaginations going. Anyway, starting with you, Governor Walker, on immigration, race, what are your comments?
Well, there's an incredible challenge, and there's consistent themes here. It goes back to what each of us said earlier in terms of tone versus record. When you look at record, again, for the president, he's actually got a pretty bold plan out there about merit-based immigration, expanding legal immigration into America, which we need not just from an immigration standpoint, but frankly, we're going to make those numbers add up. I talked about earlier on Social Security and a strong economy. One of the ways is we need to bring more immigrants into America, not just from our southern border, but from around the world. And you can do that. Unfortunately, he throws that idea out there probably because he had a good influencer on the subject matter, but doesn't spend a lot of time rhetorically explaining it or explaining it in a way that it can appeal to a larger base of people. So it's left up to the rest of us to do that. I do think, though, there are good examples. You mentioned Texas. I think if you look at Rick Scott, both his election as governor and his very close election in the United States Senate in Florida, that's because Rick Scott aggressively pursued multiple Spanish populations, whether it's further south in terms of Cuban American, whether it's some who've come from Puerto Rico who now reside in Florida, whether it's from Mexico or other parts of Latin America. I remember Rick showing me his efforts in his campaign and his ads done targeting different populations throughout there. You look at, and you mentioned Orange County, if we're going to get the U.S. House back, which I think there is a shot to do, it's going to happen not just because of Latino candidates in places like California, but a number of Asian American, including, I hope, who's be the first Korean American woman elected to Congress, who should have won the last time if they didn't have ballot harvesting in California. She would be the congresswoman from Southern California. But there are a number of candidates, in fact, some of the most promising candidates are candidates of color who represent that broader spectrum of ethnicity that I think reflects the American dream, and we've just got to support them when they're out there, because part of the reason you asked before, part of the just candid reason why sometimes in the past money isn't spent in districts, you got to have candidates. You can't just throw money and expect to win. Message, manpower, and money, the 3 M's are the key to winning elections. It starts with the right message, it follows up the manpower, meaning the people making it happen, and then the money falls. You got to have that as well. But the message, the tip of the spear of that is having the right messenger. And so in the areas where we do, we can't let them hang. If they're great candidates, we got to go find a way to help them make the mark and connect with the electorate.
All right, closing comments. So think about whether, when we're back here, whether it's after Trump's presidency, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, what's the most noteworthy thing you can imagine, predict about conservatism? What's going to be the most different? How much will Trump have changed it? You know, pick whatever time period ahead you want to skip. Tiana, you're first.
It's difficult for me to say because obviously we don't know what's going to happen in the next year, let alone in the next 5. But I think in order for there to be a future of conservatism, by any real conception of the word, not a European identitarian movement, not a radically protectionist movement with no end goal of achieving better trade deals or whatnot. If there is a conservative movement, I think it will be one that is coalition building. It will be people who, we have the Nikki Haley's of the world, we have the John Jameses of the world, who just, is now polling neck and neck with Gary Peters in Michigan. I think it's, yes, right? It doesn't have to, for all the obsession over the alt-right, which is obviously a massive issue, and it is important that us on the right condemn the alt-right, that's not what we're seeing in the numbers. Young Republicans, millennial Republicans and Gen Z Republicans, they care about the climate. They care about racial integration, and they think that diversity is good for the country. And that's why I think the future of conservatism looks like me, looks like the children and grandchildren of immigrants. It looks like Mexican Americans in Texas. But we do not get there unless if we make an affirmative case for the principles that guides conservatism. If we completely abandon all of our fiscal principles, if we resort to trolling the left, the proper response to the Virginia abortion bill was not to create a bill banning abortion in the cases of rape and incest, the one thing that the overwhelming majority of the country opposes. It does look like coalition building. It does look like making an affirmative case for, do you want to turn into California? Do you want to have hepatitis A outbreaks and tuberculosis outbreaks on the street? Have people who work 6-figure jobs who can't pay a rent or pay a mortgage? No, we don't want that. We want the future of America to be Texas, not California. And we have to make that case affirmatively. We can't just trust that people will remember the Soviet Union that's receding from many decades past.
All right, Karl.
Well, I don't know. I think it's going to be a battle to define conservatism. I do think one of the key questions is going to be whether American nationalism is more Bannonite or whether it is American patriotism. And I think that's going to be something that conservatives are going to have to argue out. I think another big issue that is likely to disrupt us, at least in the short term, is whether we are neo-isolationist. We don't have any business being in places like the Middle East or Asia. Let's bring them all home. We are protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific. Or whether we are internationalist in the sense that we understand that sometimes American leadership is vital to the success and the security and prosperity of the world, and that the world would look a lot different if we had had that neo-isolationist attitude in the aftermath of World War II or in the aftermath of the Korean War. If we had said, you know what, we've been in Europe for 5 or 6 years, bring them home. We've been in Korea, it's 56 or 57. We've been there for 5 or 6 years. We don't have any business here, bring them home. The world would be a much different place. But I do think there's going to be a debate about that. I do think the Republican Party is likely to be return to more of a free trade party when it comes to trade, albeit with an insistence upon fair trade. We're not going to be as accommodating. If you're mistreating us with unfair practices, particularly if you're stealing our stuff, we're going to be tougher. I do think we will become a fiscally conservative party because the train is coming straight for us and we better get off the tracks. And I think we will be a limited government party, but I think we will also be a party that is thinking more about what do we do for the middle class and what do we do for urban America. I love what Raheez Salam at Manhattan is doing to sort of cause us to think about how can we deal with the problems that people in big cities live with, like high cost of housing and quality of life and access to jobs. How do we help people with that by applying conservative values? So as conservatives, we never sort of take one thing and throw it out. We're very Burkean in that respect, but I think we're going to keep some of what we've gotten in the last couple of years and hopefully reinvigorate the conservatism that we all grew up with, but apply it to the new circumstances of the 21st century.
All right, we're about to get kicked off the stage, so you only get like 20 seconds, Governor.
I'm an optimist. I think, as I mentioned, Reagan made me not just a conservative Republican, but an optimist. So a decade from now, I'm optimistic, but I think we got to do a better job explaining why, not just the what. And by that, I mean we've got to talk about why we believe in these things. We've got to be positive about it. We've got to be authentic about it. After the 2016 election, I ran into a 26, 27-year-old who was hovering near me at a department store called Kohl's, and I thought, well, he's either an employee or he's a fan of mine. Turned out he was both. Came and asked for a picture, and he said, it was a crazy year. He said, I started out, he said, I'm a huge fan of yours. He said, then I supported Bernie. Then I voted for Trump. To which point I said, I want to take a picture of you. But it was a great reminder because I was curious, so I asked him a few more questions. Didn't want to be condescending, but I was just curious. And he was not ideological at all. You know, at his age, it was a gut reaction. He liked me because I stood up against the 100,000 protesters and didn't back down. He liked Bernie because he think Bernie didn't fit the stereotype. He defied all the odds. He was against the machine. He was standing up for the little guy. And he liked Trump because he thought he didn't care what the media thought about what he said, and he was going to drain the swamp. Great reminder about authenticity matters for every voter, but I think particularly for younger generations, authenticity is key, which is my last point. And that is we can't talk about conservative or liberal, right or left. We can't even talk about capitalism versus socialism. It's got to boil down to this. We're for freedom. If you're for freedom,